Welcome to Founding Chronicles. This is the place where America's forgotten stories come alive. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. Now, let's begin the story. The forgotten revolution that changed America forevermore. They say history is written by the victors. But sometimes even the victors bury stories so deep that generations forget them. America is filled with such stories, whispered, in old letters, tucked away in diaries, and fading from stone markers on overgrown graves. This story is one of those, a revolution, not spoken about in the grand halls of schoolrooms, not remembered in parades or monuments, but one that struck at the very heart of America before the nation had fully found its voice. It was a revolution that reshaped lives, towns, and the very spirit of freedom in ways so quiet, so stubborn, and so lasting that its mark still lingers. Though most no longer see it, that it began in the years when the colonies trembled under more than the weight of British rule. These were not the polished days of great speeches or the proud signing of declarations, but the raw, heavy days of ordinary folk, men and women who lived close to the land, who knew hunger in winter and sweat in summer, who carried with them a mixture of loyalty, doubt, and a growing fire they could barely name. The tide of unrest did not only swell in Boston or Philadelphia, where pamphlets and speeches stirred educated crowds. No, it found its roots in villages and crossroads, in lonely cabins where candles burned late into the night while neighbors gathered to whisper of taxes, of debts, of sheriffs who came knocking with orders to seize farms that had been in families for generations. It was in these shadows, far from the polished rooms of the elite, that the forgotten revolution was born. Picture a small New England town in the 1770s. Wooden homes stood weathered against the wind. The church bell was the town's heartbeat, summoning not only for worship, but for warnings, for meetings, for the endless decisions that bound neighbors together. The soil was rocky, the harvests uncertain. Families worked from dawn until their hands were blistered and their backs ached. And yet, despite all this labor, many fell deeper into debt, crushed not only by the weight of the crown's taxes, but by local courts, wealthy merchants, and landowners who tightened their grip. This was not a revolution of wealthy gentlemen in powdered wigs. It was a revolution of farmers and blacksmiths, widows and weavers, men who came home from war only to find themselves in debtors' prisons, and women who held their families together when everything around them seemed to collapse. They were not writing fine words about liberty. They were living through the gnawing hunger of injustice. One name echoes faintly through this story, though he himself would never have imagined being remembered centuries later. Daniel Shays. He was a farmer, a veteran of the Revolution, a man who had marched with Washington's army and risked his life for the promise of freedom. But when the fighting ended, when the young nation celebrated its independence, Shays returned home to find his world broken. His farm was failing, his debts mounted. His service to his country earned him little more than a paper certificate of pay, nearly worthless in the hard soil of Massachusetts. And he was not alone. All across the new America, men like Shays came home to land seized, wages unpaid, and families left destitute. The courts, cold and efficient, moved quickly. Sheriffs evicted families. Livestock was taken, tools were sold. And behind those sheriffs stood wealthy creditors and politicians who spoke of law and order while growing fat on the misfortunes of their neighbors. That this was not the freedom men had fought for. This was not the liberty they had dreamed of when they marched through snow barefoot, their footprints stained with blood. For many, the bitter truth became clear. The chains of tyranny had not been shattered, only exchanged. Instead of the crown across the ocean, they now faced the iron grip of a new ruling class at home. It was here, in this deep wound, that the forgotten revolution began to stir. Farmers gathered at taverns and crossroads, their faces rough with work, their eyes burning with anger. They spoke in plain words, words that carried no polish but carried truth. If their voices were ignored in the halls of government, then perhaps their actions would be heard on the roads, in the courts, in the towns where power sought to grind them down. They began to rise. At first, it was quiet resistance. Court sessions, disrupted by crowds of farmers standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the doors so no foreclosures could be ordered. Sheriffs turned away, sometimes by words, sometimes by force. Farmers refusing to pay taxes they could no longer afford, gathering instead in militias. That reminded them of the war they had just fought. But as the months passed, the movement grew. This was no polished rebellion with banners and declarations. This was a revolution of survival. Neighbors who had nothing left but each other now stood together against a system that threatened to destroy them. In barns and fields, they whispered plans. They vowed to take their fight to the very core of the new America, to remind the powerful that freedom was not a prize to be hoarded by the few, but a right born from the blood of the many. And so, under the unassuming banner of men like Daniel Shays, the people moved, armed with muskets that had once fought the British, with farm tools sharpened into weapons, with nothing but hunger and rage in their bellies. They set their sights on the courthouses and arsenals that symbolized their oppression. What followed was not a neat uprising. It was messy, desperate, filled with moments of triumph and heartbreak. Families torn between loyalty to the law and loyalty to their neighbors. Communities split, some siding with the creditors and the courts, others with the rebels who demanded mercy. It was a civil war in miniature, a struggle not of grand armies, but of neighbors staring down neighbors, of farmers facing militia, of ordinary Americans discovering just how fragile their young republic truly was. This is the revolution forgotten in the grand retelling of America's birth. Not the revolution of independence from Britain, but the revolution of justice against injustice within America itself. A revolution that shook the nation to its core, forced its leaders to confront the failures of the system they had built, and set the stage for the Constitution itself. The story of this forgotten revolution is not one of polished glory, but of raw humanity. It is the story of men and women who refused to bow, who demanded that the promise of liberty mean more than words on parchment. It is a story that echoes today, for it asks the question that has never left America: who is freedom truly for? And so, in the chill of Massachusetts winters, in the dusty courts of struggling towns, in the hearts of farmers who had given all yet been left with nothing, the fire of this revolution burned. A fire so dangerous, so unsettling that even now, centuries later, many choose not to remember it. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it: the footsteps of farmers marching, the clang of the courthouse doors being barred shut, the cries of men who had nothing left to lose. This is where it begins. The winter wind cut deep in Massachusetts, and with it came hunger, cold, and a rising desperation that could no longer be ignored. By now the murmurs in taverns had turned into plans, and the whispered anger of farmers had grown into a loud defiance that rang across villages and fields. The people were no longer pleading, no longer hoping their cries would be heard. They were ready to act. The courthouses became the first battlegrounds of this forgotten revolution. In town after town, men arrived in groups, not in uniform, not under polished flags, but wearing the rough coats of farmers, the patched trousers of laborers, the dirt of their daily lives still clinging to their boots. They came carrying muskets left over from the revolution, rusty blades, axes, and farm tools reshaped into weapons. They stood shoulder to shoulder before the courthouse doors, their faces hard, their voices steady, and they made their message plain. No court would sit, no farm would be seized, no neighbor would be dragged into prison for debts that could not be paid. And in many towns, the courts fell silent. Judges peered out at the sea of determined faces and chose not to proceed. Clerks quietly closed their books. The rule of law, so carefully written, could not hold against the sheer will of men who had nothing left but their resolve. For a brief moment, the people tasted victory. They had stopped the machinery that crushed them. But victory was a fragile thing, and the powerful were not willing to surrender so easily. Merchants, landowners, and politicians saw these actions as rebellion, as chaos threatening the fragile new order of America. They called for militias loyal to the state. They raised money to hire troops, and they whispered that these farmers, these neighbors, were nothing more than lawless mobs bent on anarchy. Among the farmers, the name Daniel Shays began to rise. He was not a politician, not a wealthy leader, but his life mirrored theirs. A soldier who had fought for liberty, now standing with those who felt that liberty had been stolen from them. His calm presence and steady words gave shape to the growing movement. Though reluctant to be called a leader, his name became the banner under which desperate men gathered. And so, Shays and his fellow veterans began to march. Their goal was clear: to shut down the courts, to stop the foreclosures, and above all, to seize the weapons stored in the Springfield Armory. If they could arm themselves with the muskets, powder, and shot that lay within those walls, they could stand against the state militia. They could press their demands. They could prove that the voice of the common man could not be silenced. Picture the scene: ragged lines of farmers trudging through snow, their breaths heavy in the cold air, muskets slung over their shoulders, their families watching from cabin doors with both pride and fear. Behind them were empty cupboards and hungry children. Ahead of them, the uncertain fire of battle. They marched not for conquest, but for survival, not for glory, but for dignity. The state, however, was ready. Wealthy merchants from Boston poured money into raising a private army, fearing that if this rebellion spread, the very fabric of property and power would unravel. General Benjamin Lincoln, a seasoned officer, was given command, and loyal militias prepared to meet the farmers head-on. And then came Springfield. The rebels, numbering in the thousands but poorly armed, moved toward the arsenal with a fire in their hearts. They believed they would be joined by others, that the weight of their cause would swell their ranks. But as they approached, they found the arsenal guarded, not by weak defenders, but by disciplined militia under General William Shepard. On that bitter January day in 1787, the forgotten revolution met its moment of truth. The farmers advanced, voices raised, muskets gripped, believing the defenders would not fire on men who were their neighbors, their kin, their fellow veterans. But the militia did fire. Cannon roared, grape shot tearing through the icy air, striking down men who had marched with nothing but hope that justice might finally be theirs. The line of farmers broke. Chaos spread. Some fell where they stood. Others fled into the snowy fields, their dreams of seizing the arsenal shattered by the cold thunder of artillery. The uprising had not ended, but its spirit had been dealt a terrible blow. Shays and his followers scattered, retreating into the hills, hiding in barns, still determined, still unwilling to give up, but now hunted. The state moved swiftly, capturing rebels, sentencing some to death, imprisoning many more. Yet even as the leaders cracked down, the fire of the movement had already burned too deep to be extinguished. Because what had happened in Massachusetts was not just about one courthouse or one arsenal. It was about the question at the very heart of the new America. Would this nation belong to the few or to the many? Would liberty mean safety for the wealthy or justice for the ordinary? News of the uprising spread across the states, carried by newspapers, letters, and the fearful whispers of politicians. To some, Shays and his men were villains. dangerous rebels who had dared to defy the rule of law. To others, they were heroes, men who had stood against a government that seemed to have forgotten the very people it claimed to serve. And far beyond Massachusetts, the echo of this forgotten revolution reached men who were shaping the destiny of the new nation. In Philadelphia, in the months that followed, leaders would gather to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, to craft something stronger, something that could hold the young republic together. And though their debates were filled with high words and careful phrases, beneath it all lay the memory of Shays' Rebellion, the reminder that ordinary Americans would not be silent when justice was denied. The forgotten revolution had failed. In its immediate aim, the farmers did not seize the arsenal. The courts reopened. The creditors pressed on. But its true victory lay in the fear it struck, the questions it forced, and the undeniable truth it revealed. The promise of liberty was still unfinished, and the voice of the common man could shake the very foundations of power. As the winter thawed and the rebels melted back into the quiet fields of Massachusetts, America was left with scars. Families mourned fathers, sons, and brothers lost. Communities carried the memory of standing in defiance together. And in the hearts of leaders, a quiet alarm rang. If this fragile nation was to endure, it must find a way to balance freedom with order, justice with authority. That balance, as history would show, would not come easily. But without the forgotten revolution of Shays and his neighbors, the path toward a stronger union, toward the Constitution itself, may never have been taken. This was the turning point, the moment when America realized that its greatest danger did not lie across the ocean, but in the voices of its own people, demanding to be heard. The cannons at Springfield had fallen silent, but the echoes of their thunder lingered across Massachusetts. For the men who had marched under Daniel Shays, the dream of seizing the arsenal had been crushed, yet their spirit was not so easily broken. They melted back into the hills and forests, hiding in the barns of sympathizers, slipping through the night on frozen roads. Winter wrapped its icy hand around New England, and with it came the long, cold reckoning of what this rebellion had. Awakened, the state moved swiftly to restore order. Governor Bowdoin, stern and unyielding, poured resources into hunting down the rebels. His government, backed by wealthy merchants who had financed the militia, wanted not only to crush the uprising, but to make an example of it. To them, the rebellion was not simply a protest against taxes or debt. It was a direct challenge to the very order of the republic. If farmers could march on a courthouse and silence the law, what would stop others from doing the same? If veterans could raise their muskets against the state, what was to prevent the new America from collapsing into chaos? And so the hunt began. Sheriffs and militiamen swept through the countryside. Neighbors who had once stood together now watched nervously, fearful of being named sympathizers. Dozens of rebels were captured. Some were dragged in chains to jails where the cold stone walls offered no comfort against the biting winds. Others, wounded from the clash at Springfield, suffered quietly in their cells, their bodies broken, but their spirits unbowed. Then came the trials. Courtrooms, once the stage for foreclosures and debt collections, now became the stage for punishment. One by one, the rebels were brought before judges who saw in them not merely farmers and veterans, but traitors to the very state they had once fought to create. The verdicts were harsh. Many were sentenced to hang. Gallows were erected, and the people were reminded of the price of defiance. Yet, something stirred among the ordinary folk who had watched the rebellion unfold. Sympathy lingered in the hearts of many. After all, these men were neighbors, kin, fellow soldiers. They had not risen for greed or conquest. They had risen for bread, for dignity, for the chance to keep their families from ruin. And slowly, whispers spread. Was it justice to hang men who had fought for liberty only a decade earlier? Was it mercy to grind them beneath the weight of law when their only crime had been desperation? The state's leaders faced a dilemma. To execute the rebels might bring order, but it would also deepen the wounds, stirring further unrest in a countryside already simmering with anger. To show mercy might encourage future rebellion, but it could also heal the fragile trust between rulers and the ruled. At the heart of this storm stood Daniel Shays himself. He had fled after Springfield, moving from hiding place to hiding place, his name both feared and revered. For some, he was the villain who had dared to challenge the state. For others, he was a hero, a man who had given voice to the voiceless. Captured comrades waited to see whether he too would be brought in chains to face the gallows. But history, as it often does, took a quieter turn. In time, many of the death sentences were softened. Some rebels were pardoned. A few were hanged, but far fewer than the leaders had threatened. And eventually, even Daniel Shays himself would be spared the rope. He lived out his days not as a triumphant hero, nor as a martyr, but as a man remembered only dimly in the corners of history books. His name carried forward more by whispers than by monuments. Yet while Shays and his followers faded back into the soil of Massachusetts, the memory of their rebellion did not. It carried far beyond the hills and valleys of New England, reaching the ears of men who gathered in Philadelphia to decide the fate of the nation. For in 1787, as the rebellion still smoldered, the leaders of the young republic met to address the Articles of Confederation. That system, crafted in the glow of independence, had proven weak. The federal government could not raise taxes, could not maintain an army, could not even ensure order in the states. And now, with Shays' rebellion fresh in their minds, the leaders understood the peril. If a band of farmers could bring Massachusetts to its knees, what would happen if unrest spread to other states? If the federal government could not respond to rebellion, what future did this fragile union truly have? George Washington, who had watched the events with deep concern, warned that the rebellion revealed a sickness in the heart of the nation. He feared anarchy, feared that the revolution's victory would dissolve into chaos unless a stronger foundation was laid. Others, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, pointed to Shays' rebellion as the clearest evidence that the Articles were broken beyond repair, and so the Constitutional Convention took shape. In the shadow of Shays' uprising, the delegates drafted a new vision of America, a stronger federal government, capable of raising troops, enforcing laws, and holding together the fragile states. The Constitution, often remembered as a triumph of political genius, was also, in truth, a direct answer to the fears stirred by farmers marching on courthouses and arsenals. Without Shays' rebellion, the urgency for such a document might never have burned so brightly. Yet the irony was bitter. For while the Constitution promised a stronger union, it did not ease the burdens of the farmers who had risen. Their debts remained. Their lands were still lost. Their voices were not enshrined in the parchment that was signed in Philadelphia. The new government brought stability, but for many ordinary Americans, it also brought the same struggle, the same distance between rulers and ruled, the same question: whose freedom was truly being protected? Still, the rebellion had left its mark. It had forced the nation to confront its own fragility. It had shown that liberty could not simply be declared. It had to be lived, defended, and shared. And though Daniel Shays did not stand in Philadelphia, his shadow lingered there, a silent reminder that America's promise could not survive if it ignored the cries of its people. In the years that followed, the memory of the rebellion began to blur. Textbooks spoke more of the Constitution than of the farmers who had driven its creation. Statues rose to the Founding Fathers, not to the veterans who had stood in the snow outside Springfield. And yet, in the quiet corners of New England, the story lived on, passed from one generation to the next, whispered in the way old stories often are half memory, half legend, but carrying a truth deeper than any law could write, because the Rebellion had never been about overthrowing America. It had been about claiming it, about reminding the powerful that liberty without justice was hollow, that independence from Britain meant nothing if ordinary men and women remained shackled by poverty and neglect. It was a warning carved into the heart of the young republic. Forget the people, and the people will rise. And so, even as Daniel Shays faded into obscurity, his revolution lived on, not in the victories he won, but in the questions he forced a nation to ask. Time has a way of softening wounds, but it also has a way of burying truths. In the years after the rebellion, as the Constitution took hold and the United States began to grow, the story of Daniel Shays and his neighbors was quietly pushed aside. It was a tale too uncomfortable for the new republic, too raw, too dangerous to celebrate. After all, how could a nation barely born hold parades for farmers who had stood against its laws? How could leaders desperate to prove the strength of their government admit that its first real test had come not from foreign armies, but from its own people? And so the memory dimmed. School children were taught about Washington at Valley Forge, Jefferson at Monticello, and Franklin in Philadelphia. But the farmers in Massachusetts, their hunger, their defiance, their desperate march on Springfield, were rarely spoken of. Their story became a shadow in the corner of America's memory, a whisper passed only among local towns, or preserved in the faded ink of diaries and town records. Silence does not erase truth. In the barns and kitchens of New England, the story lingered. Grandfathers told their grandchildren about the winter when neighbors marched together, about the day the cannons roared in Springfield, about the friends who never came home. Some told it with pride, others with sorrow, but all with the sense that something had happened which mattered more than the official histories cared to admit. The irony of it all is that the rebellion did not destroy America. It saved it. Without the shock of farmers rising against injustice, the leaders in Philadelphia might never have felt the urgency to strengthen the fragile Union. Without the reminder that liberty could not survive on words alone, the Constitution may never have been born. And yet, the names of those farmers are rarely spoken, their sacrifices rarely honored, their rebellion, so vital to the shaping of America, forgotten in the march of official memory. And so, we must ask, why was it forgotten? Perhaps because it revealed a truth too dangerous to dwell upon. That power, even in a republic, can become deaf to the cries of its people. That men who once fought for liberty can, in the next breath, find themselves oppressors. That freedom is not a gift handed down, but a constant struggle, fought again and again in every generation. To remember Shays' rebellion is to remember that America's promise has always been fragile, always contested, always demanded from below as much as it is granted from above. Yet forgetting does not erase the lesson. If anything, it makes it more urgent. Because what Shays and his neighbors stood for, the belief that liberty must reach every farm, every cabin, every family, is the same question America wrestles with still. Who is freedom for? Who is protected, and who is left behind? What good are grand words if ordinary lives are crushed beneath them? Daniel Shays himself never sought to be a legend. He lived quietly after the rebellion, slipping into obscurity. His final years spent far from the roar of cannons or the cries of courtrooms. He died in 1825, almost unnoticed, his grave unmarked for many years. A man who once terrified the state of Massachusetts, who once stood at the head of a movement that shook the republic, left this world as quietly as he had entered it. But perhaps that is fitting, for the story of Shays' rebellion was never about one man. It was about the nameless farmers, the weary veterans, the widows and children who bore the weight of injustice. It was about neighbors standing together when the law turned against them. It was about a people who demanded to be heard, even if history tried to silence their voices. And maybe, just maybe, That is why we must remember, because America was not only shaped by the great men whose statues we see in city squares. It was also shaped by those whose names were nearly lost, the ones who stood in the snow outside a courthouse, who raised a musket not for glory, but for bread, who faced down cannon fire with nothing but hope in their hearts. Their revolution may have been forgotten by history books, but it changed America Forevermore. It gave us the Constitution. It gave us the warning that power must always answer to the people. And it gave us the truth that freedom is never finished. It must be defended, nurtured, and demanded again and again by each generation that calls this land home. So when we speak of America, when we speak of liberty and justice, we must also speak of them, the farmers of Massachusetts, the veterans who would not bow, the neighbors who dared to rise. Their voices may be faint, but they are still with us, carried on the winds of history, reminding us that the struggle for freedom is never over. And if we listen closely, quietly, in the stillness of our own hearts, we can still hear them. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, the murmur of defiance outside a courthouse door, the crack of cannon fire on a bitter January day, and above it all, the unyielding cry of a people who believed that liberty must belong to all. That was the forgotten revolution. And though history tried to bury it, it lives on, as long as America remembers what it truly means to be free.